And once I get this live, I will place the link into the chat so that this is mainly for Anne.
Yeah, I already got it. It says live on YouTube in the corner, and it's clickable, and you can click view stream on YouTube or copy streaming link. It's very convenient. I have to, there. It's already streaming now, but maybe without, let me see.
This is mainly for Anne. All right, so just so you know, I think I was hearing the YouTube
yeah, I was just wondering
through your microphone.
Yeah, I was just trying to see if I can hear it, and yes, I can, and there is a small delay.
Okay.
But I think it was matching your lips when I heard your voice.
That's good. All right, for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, we will get started in about 6 minutes. And I'm also going to share with you the link to instructions for, and the relevant thing here is probably that on the second page, there are a number of text strings that are useful to type into the chat in case somebody has a question. I will go ahead and be responsible for posting the link to IES when Liam does his spot. And I'll also try to get that posted in at the end. Anything else that's relevant for us, I will just do some quick checking of the settings so that we don't get Zoom bombed.
I'm going to go ahead and set it so participants cannot unmute themselves until it's Q&A time.
Okay, great. And then, Anne, I will go ahead and make you the host. And once I do that, if you could please make me a co-host. All right, Anne, you should be the host now.
Make co-host.
Thanks. And so now people's direct messages should automatically go to you.
Awesome.
So as people ask their questions, and they'll probably be asking on either the YouTube feed or the Zoom feed, you can queue those up for me. And if people on Zoom are willing to ask their own, just you can send me the question if you want, but just let me know that that person will be asking it themselves, and I can then call on them. For those of you who are watching us on YouTube, we'll get started in about 3 minutes. Liam, I understand that we had about 250 people RSVP'd for today. So we'll find out how many of them actually join us in person, and there will be some who aren't able to join us in person, but will end up watching the YouTube feed later.
Excellent.
When I should share my screen?
You could go ahead and share your screen now.
Oh, okay.
All right. Looks like that's visible now. And I guess after the AIA announcement, we'll transfer things over to Liam, and he'll share his screen for about 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I remember that.
All right. And Sarah, would you like to be responsible for reading just the first sentence of the AIA announcement?
Yes, you told me yesterday to mention
great.
that.
And I will also mention it briefly during the intro speech, but you just give people a couple of reminders that way. Hi, Mike, welcome.
I'm here, yes.
Great. We have the YouTube stream started. Feel free, if you're on the YouTube stream, to post any messages as we're going through this. I'm assuming that Liam has given you the link for that IES is using today.
He has, yes.
Great. We will be getting started in, actually, we should get started right about now. Okay. All right, Anne, if you want to go ahead and admit people from the waiting room, we'll get started as soon as they arrive.
All right, everyone in the waiting room is now admitted.
Great, thanks. Hello, everyone. My name is Nathaniel Jones, and I would like to thank you for joining this webinar, Rethinking Daylight Metrics by Sarah Motamedi. This webinar is hosted by the IBPSA-USA Research Committee with the goal to share new ideas from research to the building simulation community. Today's webinar is sponsored by IES. If you have any questions during this webinar, please type them in the chat window. At the end of this 40-minute presentation, I will unmute our audience on Zoom for a discussion with Sarah. AIA Continuing Education credit is available for attending this webinar. Please email info@aiaeb.org with your AIA membership number to receive credit for attending today's event. And now, I'd like to introduce Sarah Motamedi. Sarah, please take it away.
Hi, this is Sarah. Today I'm going to discuss about the daylight metrics and how to rethink the future of daylight metrics. The material of this course actually have been verified for AIA credit. So I encourage everyone who is interested to obtain the credit to apply and send an email to info@aiaeb.org.
Thanks. And I want to introduce Liam O'Brien, who's joining us today. Sorry, Liam Buckley, who's joining us today. My apologies, Liam.
So I'm going to stop sharing and let him.
You see my screen?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So ISV software is an integrated suite of design tools. Once you open ISV, you will see a selection of lighting and daylighting specific apps on the left. In terms of their capabilities, the first is electric lighting design, which allows manufacturer.ies files to be imported, analyzed, and placed in a room via a quick array tool. Once the luminaires have been placed and calculations are complete, Illuminance contour plots can be created for any horizontal or vertical surface. Design lighting power densities can also be calculated. For daylight design, available metrics include daylight factor and useful daylight illuminance, UDI, which is an annual climate-based daylight metric. For lead version 4.1, both daylight options are available, with IES LM83's requirement for spatial daylight autonomy probably being the most popular. For glare simulation, there are two common analyses types: the climate-based annual sunlight exposure and daylight glare probability. which is used more for design condition scenarios using a fixed eye position. In terms of Isv software features, there are three worth highlighting. The first is the libraries of data, including glazing assemblies, furniture components for all building types and functions, and surface materials allowing for modifiers like BSDFs. Second is simulation control with varying sky models and speed enhancements using local CPU cores or the local GPU via Accelerad. Our next release will also include an integration of DaySim into ISV, and some users may prefer those results. Finally, photosensor controls couple daylight simulation with Apache energy simulation and allow for accurate sub-hourly control of electric lighting, which helps with meeting energy code compliance. For more information, there's a free 90-minute beginner training on our website that covers all of these topics. There should be a link in the chat window for those who are interested. Thank you. Nathaniel, Sarah, back to you.
All right, thank you, Liam Buckley. And now back to Sarah. Sarah, you're muted, by the way.
Okay. Okay, so I wanted to start the presentation by providing some bio about my background. I got my PhD in sustainable design from UT Austin, and I have been senior building performance analyst at Interface for about 5 years. And I have been experiencing daylight analysis, energy analysis, thermal comfort analysis, CFD simulation, and I have been involved in lots of LEED and Title 24 project and net zero energy buildings. My particular interest is actually daylight and energy optimization and automating the whole process of reading data and organizing them. So I would actually like to start the presentation slow because I know that people are joining our meeting. And in the beginning, I would like to introduce the daylight metrics, and it may be slightly repetitive for some of you who are attending this this meeting. And but I do think that the overview, going through the overview of daylight metrics actually provide a great foundation for us to become ready to dive deeper into the challenges of the current metrics and what is going to be the future of our metrics. So before going to describing the daylight metrics, I think that we have to understand that daylight satisfaction is a sensation. And the way that we come up with the daylight metrics and the threshold was through surveys and doing on-site experimentation. And that is actually being that much qualitative is the reason that's why the thresholds and the metrics are always changing. And so we are gonna discover more about daylighting, and as we're discovering it more, we're gonna develop more daylight metrics that can be a present, that can represent the effective daylighting, which is like even distribution of daylight in the space. In general, there are two daylight metrics. One is just only dealing with the horizontal light, which is the amount of light that we are receiving on a desk, and we call it also daylight availability. And the other one is the visual comfort, which we usually hear about it as like glare problems. Today, I'm not gonna go over glare and visual comfort discomfort because that by itself, it needs its own presentation, and by itself is very, very complicated as well. It's beyond the scope of this meeting. So let's start with the grandpa metric, which is daylight factor. It's a ratio of inside illuminance at one point of interest to unobstructed horizontal illuminance under the CIA overcast sky. This metric actually started around late 18th century, maybe the beginning of 19th century. And it is still a good indicator of daylight presence in the space. When you hear the number, you can get a feeling of how the daylight is in the space, but it still has its own drawbacks. You know, it doesn't consider the climates, different skies, different geometry, complexity of the geometry, reflection from the surrounding buildings. So it has its own drawbacks. The other metric is lux, which is the horizontal light, and the amount of light that is divided by the surface that it falls onto. So I just want to mention that there's a difference here between illuminance starting with I and the luminance starting with L, and sometimes people get confused with it. So today we are only discussing about illuminance, which starts with I and is relevant to daylight availability. As I said, it's the amount of light that falls onto the surface. And then if it's enough, you can carry on with your task. But luminance actually is the amount of light that is going to be reflected by surrounding surfaces and falls into your eyes. And therefore it heavily depends on your view direction. And glare, actually, we believe that is a function of luminance, which starts with L. So we have two types of metrics. One is a static metric, which we measure them at one point in space and at time under a specific sky condition. Imagine that you have one point in the space, you're just having your illuminance meter and just going there and just measure that at one specific time. But in reality, we have different points on the space. We have grid points. And then we are not going to measure it at one point in a day, but basically we are going to measure it for over the whole year. So we believe that modern metric is a two-dimensional, and it has time dimension, and also it has location dimension. So hopefully we think that dynamic metrics can represent the average daylight performance over the whole year for the whole space over different sky condition that is reported by a Weatherfy. So let's talk about the LEED. LEED actually accepted the static, sorry, there's an error there, but a static metric, which was DF, which at the time was very widely has been used and accepted by the professionals in the field. But nowadays they are moving toward more like a modern metrics that can represent the daylight performance over the whole year. So, but they are still offering static metrics for people who are not interested in the modern metrics. But when they move to the modern metrics, they propose STA, which I'm going to explain to in a few minutes. But what happens is that when we move to the modern metrics, we just actually lost our projects because we knew that we cannot meet the current metric of LEED, and unfortunately we lost a lot of scope there, and people were not interested in doing daylight anymore, and it was only because we knew in the beginning that there's no way that we can meet the current LEED metric. So there are actually a bunch of daylight dynamic metric, but today I'm only talking about the most famous one, which is like daylight autonomy and spatial daylight autonomy. And I'm gonna go over the LEED spatial daylight autonomy, which is slightly different than spatial daylight autonomy. So daylight autonomy is the percentage of annual occupied hours when daylight meets the minimum illuminance threshold. Usually it's like 300 lux for an office building. And then spatial daylight autonomy is the percentage of floor area that receives sufficient daylight for at least 50% of the occupied hours. So when I read these definitions to you, you will think that, oh, it's easy, it's, you know, the percentage of annual occupied hours, or is the percentage of floor area. The way that it's written and the way that we understand them, it seems very easy, but in reality, you have to do the hand calculation in order to figure out like what is behind the metric. And when you do the hand calculation, then it just pops up in your head that probably there is something off here and there. So Okay, so say that we have a box on the right and we have the grid points there. You can see the desk, it's a top view. And then on the left, I have just a chunk of my data the columns x1 to x7 say that is my grid points, and each row actually represents the hourly data. So, and I just highlighted the occupied hours. So what we have to do, and then each cell actually is the locks for that specific time, for that specific location. So what we have to do is just like removing all the data from unoccupied hours, and we are not interested in any data that is below 300 locks. So the red and highlighted cells are the ones that we are interested in. And then we put 0 for the ones that are not meeting our threshold, and we are putting 1 where actually meets the threshold. So then at the end, I calculate the DA for each grid point. So the first one is like 70%, and the second one is 100%, meaning that 100% of the time, this specific node meets the daylight criteria. So you can see that for each node, I have some sort of a number. Because I do have that, then I can present it on my plan. So the closer I am to the window, it's going to be red, which basically means that most of the time it meets the daylight criteria. And the deeper I go, it becomes bluer, which basically means that we have lack of daylight there. So let's go and calculate SDA. So SDA actually is like we are adding another line, and we say that if it is above 50%, then we are interested in, and if it's not, then it's not qualified. So you can see that I put no and yes. So if it was bigger than 70%, I said, sorry, 15%, I said no. Sorry, I said yes, and then the others I said no. And then what you do is just you calculate how many yes you have, and then divide it by the total, and that is going to be your SDA. So in this case, it was like 57% of the space meeting my daylight threshold. So what you see here is that we do have some sort of cutoff age, like 50% of the annual occupied hours for the metric. And also we don't really calculate the points that the daylight illuminance is under 300 lux. So we just eliminate all those data from our analysis. So let's talk about lead SDA. Lead SDA is slightly different than SDA. I say slightly, but they just threw another dimension to our calculation. And I get this graph from Lightness website. It's very, very informing, and I recommend everyone to just go to their website, and if they are interested, go and review what they have written there. So what lead is saying is that we need automatic blinds. And why is that? So say that this is the place that we have. So it has a large windows. It does have a shade here and there. And they are measuring the illuminance for this space over time at 10 a.m., 11 a.m., 12 a.m., 12 p.m. and etc. So the red dots actually shows that this space is receiving too much daylight. And based on our experience, we have figured out that if it is too much daylight, then people are more willing to go and bring down their shades, and therefore you're not gonna get the full benefit of daylight, and it's gonna be darker. So that is very important, especially when you are inputting that data to your energy simulation and figuring out how much of your daylight can save energy. So that's why LEED is suggesting basically to use automatic blinds. And the way that they suggest is that whenever it's 2% or more of your analysis grid is receiving direct sunlight, we want you to bring down your shades. So basically there is no shade in the project. They're just assuming that, okay, there is an automatic blinds there. And now what is the SDA? Now what is our spatial daylight autonomy? So the third row actually shows that the blinds are down now. And then the last row actually shows how daylight autonomy is after we are applying the shade. So you can see that now we don't have really that red spots, and probably the average illuminance in the space actually dropped as well. So this is just something that SDA, the lead added it, and it just creates more, challenges to how we calculate the data. So, but don't forget that we are moving a long way. We started from having a grandpa DF, and now we have, dynamic new one, which, represent the daylight over the whole year, over the whole space. It's a better metric, and we all agree on that. It's because it's two-dimensional, including spatial and temporal information, and it's easy to understand whenever we say that, oh, it's like 50% of the floor area receiving, enough daylight. It's just, people can understand it better. But what is the problem? So I'm just throwing out some hypothetical question here, which actually occurred to my head when I did the hand calculation. And I was like, I'm not really sure. So say that we have lead criteria SDA of 50%, and all my buildings are meeting that criteria. And so basically, can I have an example that hypothetically I can have a space which half of the space is illuminated, and then I can hypothetically have a space, have a space that every other grid points is illuminated. Then these two, based on the lead criteria, is going to be the same. They're going to have the same SDA, but we know that they're totally different. So, for example, the other example can be like when you have like a big windows in the center of your space, and you're receiving daylight, and you have some spots on the corners that are darker, probably on the edge of the walls are darker, but majority of the space in the middle is illuminated. But compare that to a space that you have a corner window, a really large corner window, which basically exactly half of your grid points are on, but the other half is off. So, but you will get the same number for these two because you have a threshold of 50%, but the daylight performance in these two examples are totally different. So the other question that we may ask ourselves is that what if I have a space, these are all imagination. I know that it's not existed out there, but just want to show that the drawbacks in the way that we calculate the current daylight metrics. So imagine that you have a space that is dark half of the year, or it's dark every other day, or if it's dark only half of a day. Based on our calculation, the current metric, they're all going to get the same number. So these are the drawbacks within the way that we are calculating our current daylight metric. So what I said, I was like, what if I just come up with some scenarios that they have the same SDA and see that if really the daylight, the daylight presentation is different. So here you can see that I have a box 14 feet and then 14 by 12 feet, and then the height is 10 feet. And then I have a center window, I have a corner window, I have a clear story window, and I have smaller window but distributed over all the wall. And then I calculate the lead SDA for each scenario. And to be honest, I really played a lot with them in order to get the same SDA, and it's not really easy. So yeah, so all of them have around SDA of 31%. So based on this, you may say that, well, they seem equal, so they have the same daylight performance. So, but the reality is they're not. So look at the DA in for different scenarios. So the first scenario has a better daylight performance than the second. You can exactly see that whenever I have a corner window, almost half of my space is in dark. And then the other one, which is clear story, you have more even distribution of daylight, but it's lower because I have a smaller window. And then the distributed one is like the one that has the worst daylight performance. So basically they're not the same. So the question is why we have this problem. So I think that one of the problems is that we have the thresholds, and we also not include the times or the spaces that doesn't really meet the 300 lux. So we only count the numbers of hours that meet the daylight illuminance targets. Say that in this graph, we have lux on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis, we have different time steps. And the graph shows the hourly illuminance over one spot in the grid. And I have two scenarios, the blue scenario, and then I have the yellow scenario. So what we actually calculate is, I just put the bar when we are calculating. So I am calculating the hours that the space meets the criteria, and both scenarios meeting the criteria exactly the same way. So they're gonna get the same number. But we know that the blue one doesn't perform better. Sorry, the yellow one doesn't perform better because it's darker. And you can see that the yellow one actually is really dark, going down more than the blue one. So what we do is just like, we don't really care what's happening under the 300 lux and how often that happens. So what should we do? Basically, I'm suggesting actually calculating darkness. So darkness is how far each node is from the illuminance target. It's an easy formula, high school mathematics formula. If like you have 1 point in the space, you're just calculating the distance from your point to your desired point, which is like 300 lux. And then because you are looking for the distance, you use the power 2. But in reality is that you have to do that for all your points. So basically it's integral. I'm not really sure if you are familiar with the integral, but it's the area that we are interested in. You have to repeat the same thing for all your nodes. And the formula is gonna be the one that I'm showing here. It's the sigma, it's the sum of the distances under your threshold. So now basically what I want to compare is like, I want to compare the area of the ones in the scenario 2, which is yellow, and compare that to the area of the scenario 1, which is blue. And I can totally see that the blue is smaller than the yellow, and therefore blue is better than yellow because it's not as dark as yellow. And that darkness doesn't happen as often as scenario 2, the yellow one. The next step is that I'm introducing the darkness intensity, basically how often that happens and what is the ratio of the darkness over the worst case scenario, because you always want to compare it to the worst case scenarios to something to have a feeling of how well your space is performing. So imagine you have a room in the corner of your building, it doesn't have a window and it's dark. Every dot in that space, it gets 0 lux over the whole year. So that is your worst case scenario. And you are comparing the darkness of your project with that worst case scenario. So the worst case scenario is gonna be, here is gonna be the gray area, which is like the rectangular under the 300 lux, and you are comparing the blue area, and you will divide the blue area over the area of the rectangle, gray rectangle. And the formula, I just put it there. So you are gonna divide that by n, multiply t, multiply 300, and n is the grid numbers, t is the occupied hours, and 300 is your illuminance target. Okay, so far we only discussed one-dimensional. We only talk about like the time. We didn't really talk about the different grids. So basically in reality, we have grids. So our shape doesn't look like this. The shape actually, it's not a curve, it's a surface. So it's probably looking something like this, which is like, sometimes it goes under 300 lux, sometimes it goes above, sometimes it's around the 300 lux. So it's a surface with ups and downs here and there. So here, the illuminance target just highlighted there in the graph, it's just the surface, one flat surface. So what is the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario is the box under your target surface. It's the whole box under the target surface. What you are calculating is the volume of your surface that's under your target surface. So what basically you're doing is that you are dividing your darkness volume over the worst case scenario volume. I highlighted as a red, like a red color. So I calculated the darkness intensity for different scenarios, and basically what I found that my darkness scenario is 0.04 for the first, for the second is 0.05, for the third is 0.05.5. Anyway, so, and I ordered them the way that they present better daylight performance. So the first scenario has lowest darkest intensity comparing to the rest. And the worst case scenario is the distributed one. We basically can calculate this for every node in the space. And we can also present that as a graph that I showed here. We can do that as well, but I didn't do it. I was only interested in one number. What is my darkness over the whole space over the whole year? Because it's easier for me to compare my different scenarios. But generally speaking, you can do the same calculation for each node in the space and basically visually see how it looks like in this space, which space is darker than the others. I also calculate other metrics because I want to have a comparison to figure out which metrics is better than the others. We know that SDA, just lead SDA, doesn't perform very well. We can see that, as I mentioned before, SDA is the same for all the scenarios. The mean daylight factor is different. So corner one shows 3 is better than the mean daylight factor, but you can see that still the center window is better than the corner, and corner better than clear story, and clear story better than the distributed one. So I think that I also put the daylight, the typical SDA without considering the lead. So you can see that the SDA is like 100 for the first, 87 for the second, 98 for clear story, and the last one I think is 50 something. Yeah, so when I compare like going back and forth between like different metrics and the darkness intensity that I calculated, I figured out that actually mean daylight factor is a good metric. If you are calculating it over the occupied hours, it can represent the average performance of the space. So if you don't want to use daylight factor, you can also use just illuminance, mean illuminance. But if you want to go deeper, then you can also do darkness intensity. But the current SDA and stuff, they don't really work well in comparison between different scenarios. So the conclusion that I want to make is that spatial and temporal threshold that we put in the dynamic metrics provide some sort of simplicity and makes the metric easy for us to understand. But we have to keep in mind that we are just adding a cutoff age, which actually eliminate portion of data from our analysis and make some scenarios exactly the same while they're not the same. And therefore, it's with the current dynamic metrics, considering having some spatial and temporal threshold, it makes the comparison harder between different daylighting strategies. So I do believe that the new metrics, such as the one that I'm just presenting here, darkness intensity, can be used for comparison of different daylight configuration. Yeah, I still think that we have a long way to go regarding the daylight metric, and we need more studies to figure out which scenario, because at the end of the day, we want to be able to compare different scenarios for our design. And unfortunately, LeadSDA, at least it doesn't really provide the platform or the measure for us to compare different metrics. So we need to come up with other metrics to solve this issue. Yeah, that was it. So I'm open for questions.
All right, Sarah, thanks. That was a very thought-provoking presentation. So I want to thank you for that. And I want to invite everyone to come up with questions, and please put your questions into the chat. And we can then, if you are on, join us on Zoom, we can call on you and invite you to ask those. I also want to remind everyone that AIA learning units are available for this, and please email your AIA membership number to info@aiaeb.org for that. As I'm giving people a moment to come up with their own questions, I'd like to ask one of my own. The question is about daylight uniformity. It looks like one of the things that you're really trying to do here is promote daylight uniformity, but I'm wondering how can you differentiate uniformity spatially from uniformity temporally? Let's say like evenness of the space at one point in time compared to the changes happening in the daylight level from one time to the next.
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I tried to briefly explain it, but maybe I was not really successful in doing so. So basically, you can do the calculation. Sorry, let me go back. So you can do your calculation for each node in the space over the whole year. If you do that, so if you figure out how far your data is from the best case scenario, then you can do that for each node in the space. So how dark is this node is for the whole year. You can calculate that, and then you can come up with a number. And then each node in the space can have its own number. And therefore, you can basically visually map it on your plan and have some feeling of how it looks like. And it's the same thing. You can do the same calculation, which is the one that I showed here, like horizontally. So you can do it over the whole space for each specific time, or for interested time that you are interested in. So yeah, you can do it whatever you prefer to do it. But for me, because I wanted to just compare different scenarios, I didn't want it to just go over the temporal and the spatial. I just want one number. That's the way that I did it. But of course, so like say that, like here, you can have different bumps here and there. You know what I'm saying? So you can only calculate your bumps, the bumps under the surface of your threshold on the x-axis, or you can just calculate it on the y-axis, or you can consider it in both axes. In this study, I just do it in both axes, but as I said, you can do the calculation in either dimension.
All right, thanks. We have a question coming in from Sandeep. Sandeep, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so my question was, there were two scenarios that you spoke about, the yellow and the blue. Sorry about that. Yellow and the blue scenarios. I just wanted to know what the actual window configurations were that you tested that on. I know you were trying to show the concept here of how we do the calculation, but I was interested in what the background was, like what window configuration you chose.
Yeah, I just put this graph there because I just wanted to visually say that where the problem is, and they are not really related to the actual energy model. I just wanted to show that what are the problems. So they're not really representing any actual model. They're just like a hypothetical situation when I have two different curves. One of them is really dark and the other one is not dark. So, but the rate of the darkness, like how often that darkness happens, maybe is the same. So, but one space is really dark and the other is not really dark. So how can you differentiate between these two scenarios? So that was the reason that I put this graph there, but they're not representing any actual model.
Thanks, Sandeep. Here's a question coming from No. Did you use the same window to wall ratio for each of the examples that you showed us?
No, that's a good question. No, I didn't, because that was not my concern. My concern was, how can I prove my hypothesis that the current metric, if you meet it, doesn't really show that, doesn't really show the daylight performance in this space. So let's see. So here you can see that the SDA, which is the current metric, I actually played with the window to wall ratio to meet almost exactly the same SDA. And then I looked at the daylight performance because I knew that they were different, but the SDA, the metric doesn't show it. So as I said, SDA is the same for all of them. So you may think that they have the same, almost the same daylight performance, but in reality, they don't.
All right, thanks. Here's a question coming in from Guillermo. The question is about Dynamo or Grasshopper's ways of calculating these. And can you give some tips on how you could calculate this metric using those tools?
Yeah, I haven't used Dynamo yet. I have just briefly used the Dynamo. I just used, to be honest, the way that I did it, it was very simple. I just put it in the Diva and I got the Illuminance data out of it and just write on a script and calculate the darkness intensity. That's how I did it. I didn't really get involved with the Grasshopper or with the Dynamo. I may actually put it on the website for everyone to just upload their Illuminance, which comes out of the Diva software, and you guys can calculate it by yourself to figure out what is the darkness intensity is for your specific project. But as I said, this is I just started doing this research, which I had it in my mind, so I really didn't have time to put it on the website for you guys and share it with you at this time. But it shouldn't be that difficult. I have worked with Grasshopper and I did my analysis there. So you just need to use this formula here. And that's it.
Thanks. We have a question coming in from Mariam. Mariam, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, sure. Firstly, thank you for your great presentation. My question is that when we are calculating the latest DA, one of the main contributor to the results, it's the shade that should be closed whenever more than 2% of the space receive direct sunlight. And my question is that when you are comparing different metrics like mean daylight factor or darkness intensity, are you applying the same shade or no?
Thanks for asking that question. No, actually, I don't really do that. I don't add the shades. And as I said, this is like another dimension or another complexity that you can add to your calculation. And Lead added add that complexion to their calculation, but I didn't really consider it in my calculation process, because for me, it was just a hypothesis that I always had in my head. And I wanted to prove that, oh, the hypothesis makes sense and we have to think about it.
Thank you.
Okay.
And here's a question coming in from Iman. What about metrics like EML, that's a melanopic lux? Can we approach those in the same way?
Sorry, I'm not really familiar with EML. Can you explain what is it?
It's equivalent melanopic lux is a measure of light intensity for circadian rhythms.
Exactly. So this approach actually can be applied to anything. So if you have any data that is two-dimensional, you definitely can add this scenario. It's like you have to calculate the volume or the surface under your target and then divided that by the worst case scenario to have a feeling where your project is at. So definitely you can use the same formula and apply it to anything that you are interested if it's two-dimensional.
Okay, thanks. And we have a question coming from Jikai. Jikai, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you, Sarah, very much for your fascinating presentation. Actually, I'm a thermal comfort person. I'm doing the same thing. Temporal variability, spatial variability, very important. And currently, we don't have such matrix to quantifying annual, seasonal, these diurnal things. And yes, and my simple question, how big is the room? And if the simulation area is bigger, such as auditorium, do you think we should subdivide the space further? Because currently I'm looking at small urban spaces, like alley, like a courtyard. If these spaces are not like uniform as a small room, as you said at the end of your presentation, you think the single value is single, it's more informative. But if that space become more complicated, do you think that single value still stand that point? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let me think about it. I think that say that you have a complex floor plan. Like it's not a simple, right now I can say it's like, I think it was 10 by 12. It's a very simple model. Yeah, it's, it's 12 by 14 and the height is 10. It's just like a simple room with like a window in it. But if it wasn't simple, I still think that the metric actually works. It doesn't really matter if your space is complex or your floor plan is complex, because it does calculate. So say that you have a complex shape, it's like L or even U shape, then you probably are going to have a lot of darkness around the edges, around the corners. So this formula actually shows that that would work, because it does take into consideration of darkness for those spaces. So my theory is that probably it should work. I don't really see any reason that it shouldn't work. Regarding the volume, I still think that that's the same thing. Maybe Nathan, you are better than me, I don't know. Because even though if you have a complex volume vertically, still you are calculating your illuminance at, for example, you have to calculate at somewhere, like you are calculating it at your desk level. So, so when you are doing the simulation, you have to make sure, if you have a complex geometry, I will definitely recommend to increase your AB factor. And therefore the illuminance that you will receive on the grid point is more accurate. So it shouldn't really matter what kind of formula you use. Actually, when you have a complex geometry, I would recommend you to make sure that you are putting correct, simulation parameters that can help with like having a correct illuminance levels at the desk level.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, thanks. We have another question coming from Ali. Ali, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Great that we are in the current slide. So my question is, generally when we are not dealing with a sophisticated team, or let's say we have a builder who is even designing and building a simple structure like a single family. And the good example is today is, for example, when you have rooms with multi-functions, you are having your working desk at the corner and you have your bed on the other side. So can we generally make recommendations looking at this picture, center window, corner window, and saying, okay, maybe the corner window for the working space in a bedroom is the best solution, or maybe the clear story window is the optimum solution for a working space, or things like that. Can we do that just without going through the calculation necessary or modeling, and having some advantages or disadvantages of all these options? That would be great to know.
Yeah. Thank you, Ali. So I totally understand. Whenever you are in a project, you just want to know which scenario works for you. You may not even have time to do all this complicated calculation and, you know, even running your simulation and stuff. So there are actually some rules of thumb for people to use, like how tall your window should be. But basically, most of the people are saying that if you want to have even distribution of daylight, they always say that you better to have some small clerestory at the top, and then the rest doesn't matter. So if you want to have corner windows here, or you want to have center, or if you want to have distributed, as long as you have some clerestory at the top, then you just make sure that you have a deeper penetration of daylight into this space. So I think that it's the best case scenario is a combination of clerestory with whatever you want. And to be honest, each project has its own context. So I don't really think it's appropriate to say that, oh, corner window is better than the center window, or center window is better than distributed. It really depends on the floor plan, the function of this space. As you said, maybe your desk is in the corner. You may want to have the corner window, but generally speaking, we may not really suggest the corner window because it doesn't really perform well, because it does create a really large area that is dark, and then it provides a better daylight performance at the corner. But as I said, as a rule of thumb, we don't really suggest corner window regarding daylight availability. But if you have a building that needs some sort of desk there, or you have specific functions going on around that corner, then the corner window makes sense. So I would recommend what I would like is a combination of clerestory with whatever you want. So as long as I have clerestory, I think I feel fine. But in reality, this is not what's going to happen. Not everyone or not every project would accept clerestory. So that's another problem that we have. But if you're looking at like, okay, Sarah, I'm not really interested in doing all these really difficult calculation of STA, UDI, you know, all these metrics, and I'm really confused which metric I should use to compare different scenarios. If you don't have anything, and if you don't have the skill to do the calculation that I did for darkness intensity, I would suggest you to just go to get the mean illuminance in this space. The mean illuminance in this space is better than having cutting edge here and there, and then you are just excluding a portion of data from your analysis. That's my idea. It's just to me, it's better when it comes to comparison of different scenarios.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also, maybe to take into account as a designer, maybe we have some other parameters like views that are not necessarily measurable or calculable. So maybe that's also another parameter.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't really went through what is the effective daylighting that much, but the reality is that all these things are somehow connected. So when we are talking about daylight, we only talk about daylight availability in this space. We didn't talk about visual comfort. We didn't talk about how great your view is, how tall your view is. We didn't talk about the impact of your large window on your energy performance. So right now we're just analyzing everything in its own bubble rather than considering it as a holistic one. So definitely, I think that in future, people are more willing to do more holistic analysis and combining different metrics in order to compare the different scenarios. I have done for my dissertation considering glare, daylight availability, and energy performance. I didn't consider view at the time, so I went through that, and I think that you can come up with some sort of metric and figure out. Maybe you can add your metrics together, or if you somehow make your metrics unit free, if you get it as like a percentage, and then you can add them together, and then when you sum your metrics, let's say that your energy, your glare, and then your daylight, then you can compare different scenarios with that metric. And for your information, I know that there is another research is going on currently at Berkeley, which considers the view. So it's not there yet, but I'm pretty sure that in probably next year or next 2 years, we're gonna have another metric for view, which we can include that in our calculation and in our decision.
All right, thanks, Sally. Here's a question coming in from YouTube. This is from Ladan. She's asking about uniformity metrics, and why not use a metric like the maximum illuminance divided by the minimum illuminance? In the clear story case, you get the best ratio there, and wouldn't that be a useful thing to use?
Can you repeat, like divide what with what? Sorry.
The maximum illuminance divided by the minimum illuminance.
Yeah. That doesn't give you the whole story. It just provides like some information. Like it just shows you, well, in the whole space, we have that illuminance ratio, that illuminance contrast. Like say that you have like large window there, and then you have a dark spot there, you divide your max with the minimum, and you're like, oh yeah, this space has a contrast ratio of this number. So in that case, it's just one number, and it's for, you have to repeat that. If you want to use that, you have to again repeat that for every node in the space, like, no, not every node, but for every hour. And then figuring out what is going to be your contrast ratio for the whole year, rather than just one contrast ratio. Let me think a little bit more about it. And it's not really good. Let me explain. Sorry, these are just hypothetical and we are just brainstorming here, and it's a really good question. So I never really thought about it before, but it's just, I think it's just mathematical. So let's see, I have this graph here. Say that when you are dividing the max with the minimum, so it's like a line from the max to minimum. And when you are comparing different scenario, your max with them, you can have different scenarios with totally different daylight presentation, but with the same max to mean. So that's why I don't really think that would work. Say that, like here, actually, the max and comparing the max and the mean, you can see that the distance, if you put the node at the top and one node at the bottom, almost they may have the same, well, not here though. No, not here. But you can have like a graph. I wish that I have a pen to just draw it for you. But you may have a graph that have exactly the same max to mean ratio, but totally different illuminance performance, because it's not just about max and mean, but rather the distance between the illuminance at the spot with the minimum threshold that you have. That's what matters, and how often that happens. So you may have great max to great max to mean ratio, low max to mean ratio, but you may have a lot of dark spot in your space. Like generally speaking, it's very dark, and also it's very dark, and your illuminance max to your mean ratio is low too. So if that is low, that doesn't necessarily mean that your space is performing well, because still it's dark.
All right, thanks. We've got a question coming from Suhas. Suhas, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Sarah. So I'm on the standards development side, and I wanted your perspective as a practitioner that how often are project teams analyzing contribution of daylight to vertical illuminance? And what could be useful metrics to quantify the contribution of daylight to vertical illuminance or melanopic lux? Just for context, the well building standard requires project teams to meet requirements of melanopic lux on the vertical plane with daylight and without daylight.
Okay, so did he ask about, sorry, I couldn't hear, vertical illuminance?
Yeah.
Okay, so vertical illuminance at the eye level?
Yes.
Or vertical illuminance at the wall? Sorry, I'm not really
at the eye level.
At the eye level. So what I know is that vertical, like this is where I said that it's beyond the scope of the presentation, but I don't mind to discuss about it. One of the reasons that we usually use the vertical luminance at the eye level is just we think that maybe it can present the glare issue. Like if it's too much, then we can figure out that can cause glare. But there have been a lot of studies showing that it may or may not be a really good metric. But I know that probably other platforms are adopting this metric because it's easier to calculate comparing to do the luminance analysis. But I'm not really sure if that is a good metric at this point for that. Regarding the other one, I'm not really familiar with that metric, so I can't really put into, I'm not really familiar with that metric, so I can't really add anything to that.
All right, thanks. We've got two related questions coming in from YouTube. One from Christian: how come you based your metric on darkness instead of lightness? And from No, if you're going to include all parts that are dark, should you also add an upper limit for too much illuminance?
That's a really good question. The reason that I consider the darkness, it was because sometimes we only have one threshold, like a minimum threshold. The reason we have darkness because we have minimum threshold. If you had only maximum threshold, only and only, then we have to calculate brightness. So basically it's going to be reverse. How much, like all the calculation is going to be reversed. You are just calculating the distance of, say that this 300 lux is your upper limit, then you are just calculating the distance for whenever your illuminance is higher than the 300 lux. So it's going to be the area above your threshold or the volume above your surface of threshold. So, so that's why I calculate the darkness, because I have minimum illuminance target, which was 300 lux. But it doesn't mean that, like if, for example, say that your space is not 300 lux, is 200 lux, or it's 100 lux, or it's 0. But in the current metric, we don't really differentiate between those. And the reality is that they do contribute to the overall daylight performance of the space. So that's why I call them darkness, because I wanted to just show that how far we are from the, our target, but it's not really, I just put the darkness, you can call it whatever, loss, daylight inavailability in that space. And the other question was about the upper limit. Yeah, exactly. I didn't really went through that because I didn't have time, to be honest, for this presentation to do the upper limit as well. But for example, we know that for UDI, we say that 200, for example, 200 and 2000 lux is the range of illuminance that we are interested in. You can do the same analysis for when you have lower limit and upper limit. So basically what you do is just you are doing the distance that comes below your line, and then also you calculate the distance if it's above your threshold of 2000 lux, and then you get sum of those. So regarding the volume, it's going to be the sum of the volume that is above your limit, and then it's going to be also the sum of the volume that's under your minimum threshold. So you can apply it. So it's just what I'm suggesting here is like, maybe we should just do distance. Maybe we should just distance rather than just saying that, oh, it's like if it's 50% above, if 50% of occupied hours emitted, or if we just do like 50% of the floor area emitted. Maybe we have to calculate that how far we are from our perfect scenario. That's what I want to say.
Okay. Well, thanks. And here's a question coming from Marshall. Marshall, would you like to ask your question? Marshall, are you here?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Nathaniel. Hi, Sarah. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I work on the Luminance side. Pardon me, but I didn't get clarity on the validation side of this proposed metric, that is darkness intensity. This also connects to the slide that Ali asked his question from. Could you please go to that slide, please? Like it's, I think, 1 or 2 earlier.
What was the question?
I have a question, but I want, could you go to the slide that Ali asked the question from, where the 4 window to all ratio was shown?
Oh, this one?
Yes, this one. Yeah, thank you. So what I understood is that the SDA data was maintained for various window configs, and the darkness intensity metric was calculated for these cases using root mean square error. Since SDA averages spatially temporally, it makes sense. But what I didn't quite understand is the validation for this darkness intensity. How is this more suitable than any other metric like mean illuminance or SDA? On what basis did you line up the cases 1 through 4? Like you said, the darkness intensity lines up pretty well for these cases, but how did you line up these? How did you say that, okay, darkness intensity for 1, 2, 3, 4 goes linearly? So, or increases, but how did you validate? What is the validation? I didn't understand that part. How did you suggest that distributed has better, center is not good enough?
Yeah. So
was it intuitive?
Yeah, so that's I actually have a problem with that, because I think that sometimes we have to propose like a metric that is intuitive, and sometimes like when you say that my illuminance level is this number, you can get a feeling of, okay, what does it mean? Or if you say that the SDA is 50% or 60%, you may have some feeling of how it looks like. But what I want to say that the current SDA and the current DA that we use, they have some sort of threshold embedded in their definition, which sometimes we just don't want to think about. Like, for example, the SDA is 300 lux. Usually they put 50% there, meaning that 50% of the time, 50% of the occupied hours. So what happens is that when we add those limits, like 300 lux, 50%, then what happens is that we are just eliminating a portion of our data points, because we think that they are not valid. But the reality is that they are valid. That's what I want to say, is that if it's under that, okay, so if it's 200 lux, does it mean that it's not really good enough? There is a difference between if it's 200 lux or if it's 0. And the current metric is say that, oh no, just assume that the same. It's 200 and 0 is the same. You just don't count them. But I want to say that this is not right. The 200 lux is a better scenario than when you have 0. So that's why I think that the current metric doesn't really include that in their metric.
That makes sense. I mean, because you have spatial and temporal smashing, so there's a lot of data loss that happens in SDA. But I was asking, how do you validate that this configuration has this darkness intensity, and which makes sense? I mean, is it intuitive? That's all my question is. Like, did you think that intuitively this is better and darkness intensity matches, so it's a good metric?
Mm-hmm. For now, as I said, this is just a hypothesis that I just it's like a thought-provoking presentation, because I just thought I thought about these scenarios in my head for 5 years ago, but I really didn't put them in the test. I just did it 3 days ago. So I have to go through probably a lot of more scenarios, a lot of more designs to figure out if this is really better than the other metrics out there. I think that it is, because I think that what matters is that how much far you are away from your target. That's what matters. And if your target is 300 lux, then how far you are away from that. If your target is 200 and 2000 lux, and you don't really care if it's your 200 and 2000, but you care if you are above and below 200 lux, then how far you are from your best case scenario. And I think that that's what we have to consider, is the distance that we have from the best scenario. And the current metrics, they don't have that, because they only calculate the points that they meet. The points that meet the threshold. So it's just ignoring the rest. I didn't really put a lot of, studies over like, oh, let's about what if I change the orientation, then what happens? If I change my climate, then what happens? Does this metric make sense or not? I haven't done that, but my gut feeling, considering the mathematics that is behind it, I think actually it's good, because it is the distance and it's a sum of it. So I think it's good representative. But as you said, I really didn't put a lot of effort on proving whether or not it's good. So the other thing I can say is that, let's say it's here. So where is it? I think it was last. Okay, so here you can see that, just look at the image down there. You would feel like, okay, the first scenario is better than the second is better than the third is better than the fourth one. And the number of darkness intensity just shows that.
Right.
The number for darkness intensity is lower for the first scenario, and then for the second and third and fourth. I try to prove my phone, the metric by this example. Still, I'm not really 100% sure, but I think it works. And then when you look at the DA availability and you look at the graph, you feel exactly the same thing, that the first scenario is better than the second is better than the third, and the third is better than the fourth. And it has some sort of relationship with the metric that I am proposing today. But of course, as you said, we need more verification, definitely.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Marshall. People on YouTube have a few questions about metrics for darkness. One is about UDI, so useful daylight illuminance less than 100 lux. And I think you could also put in an argument perhaps for continuous daylight autonomy that gives partial credit to light levels below 300 lux. Mm-hmm. Have you looked at those?
Yeah, so UDI, well, we can discuss what is the threshold for UDI. Every metric, every country has their own threshold. Like I think the UK has different threshold for the minimum threshold for UDI, and some people think that it's 200. Sometimes some people think that now we should go with 100. At this time, I'm not really sure which limit we want to get for the UDI. But if it's 100, I think it's good. I think it's good, because anything below that, like from 0 to 100, I'm not, like, it's so low that I'm not doing darkness intensity for it, because it's already included all the points that matters into the calculation, which is above 100. But it's still 100 is not enough. I have been into the room with only 100 lux and still wanted to have my light on in order to carry on my task, but it's good enough. So yeah, I think UDI of maybe 100 is good, because I have seen studies that if the illuminance in the space is below 100, people are definitely gonna turn on the lights. So that's for that. What was the second question?
Continuous daylight autonomy.
Oh yes. So continuous daylight autonomy, I think that it's a better daylight, because it does give partial credit for the points, and it's exactly like how far you are away from your threshold. So if it's almost the same as what we have here, it does calculate, I think, the distance. I haven't really looked at their formula. Maybe Nathan, you can join and add it. I don't really know how exactly they calculate and how they add the points. I have to do more study on that. But based on their description, I think they do calculate like how far you are, and then
it's how far away you are from 300 lux.
So
I haven't seen any. Yeah, I haven't seen any examples of it being used in a spatial context, but potentially. Here is question coming in from Iman. You mentioned earlier using a standard deviation. How did you come up with a standard deviation?
I didn't say standard deviation.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't say standard. Actually, that I was thinking about using when I was doing my simulation and my calculation the last 3-4 days. I was thinking about using standard deviation, but for some, I remember that I was about to write it down, but then I figured out that standard deviation does not work for this analysis. I don't remember why I come to this conclusion, because before I wanted to do the standard deviation, and then I was like, oh, no, that doesn't make sense. I honestly, I don't remember what was my reason to avoid using it, but maybe I just remember it. I don't know.
Okay. Bruno on YouTube is contributing to the discussion of continuous daylight autonomy. He says that his understanding is that darkness intensity works very similarly to continuous daylight autonomy, and wonders if you could describe a little bit more how they're different, or are they very similar?
I think that well, to be honest, when I did the calculation for, we had this calculation here. So when I did the calculation here, I only considered SDA and DA, which was the one that been used with LEAD, and most of people are using these two metrics. I didn't really consider CDA, continuous daylight autonomy. And I know that it's I think it's a better metric than SDA. So I don't know, to be honest, what is behind, because sometimes, as I said, when you read the definition, you think that, oh, it's good. It's really, I understand the metric, but when you go down and then do the calculation by hand, you figure out, oh no, it doesn't make sense. So you don't know how, like, do they have 50% threshold for the occupied hours, or they don't? Nathan, do you know that?
Can you say that again?
Do they have like 50% of threshold for occupied hours?
So I've seen it used as a metric, but I don't know. I haven't seen a threshold used together with it, so I'm not sure. Like, I don't think that LEAD has any target for it.
Mm-hmm. But definitely, CDA doesn't, it's not being used in LEAD, but okay. So the good metric, actually, let's put it out there here, is that you have the less threshold of, like, if you have 50% of occupied hours, that means that you are not including the days or the hours that it's slightly above or below your threshold, depending on if you have minimum or maximum threshold. So if in your calculation of CDA, you don't have that, then I would recommend it. But if you have that in the calculation, it's embedded in the calculation, then no, it's not doing the job.
Okay. And I think we have a question coming from Neslihan. Neslihan, do you have a microphone? Would you like to ask your question? Neslihan, are you here? Okay, well, I have the question in the chat, so I can try to ask it for her. Wouldn't it be enough to consider median daylight factor in uniformity, which is the ratio of daylight factor mean to daylight factor minimum, or daylight factor maximum to daylight factor minimum for all considered locations, and then also a consideration of glare?
What was the ratio? It was like mean DF over...
I think she's giving two possibilities for it. So mean to minimum or maximum to minimum.
Okay, mean DF, sorry. I thought you said average. Average DF over the minimum, am I right? And then average DF over the maximum, am I right? That's what she's talking about? Sorry,
that sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a really good point. Generally speaking, as I said, what I noticed is that minimum average DF or average illuminance, average lux works better over the occupied hours over the whole year. It's a better number. So, but if you want to get a ratio and have a better feeling, like you want to say, oh, it's 10% daylight performance, you have to make sure what you are choosing for your max and mean. Because if you go with the max and mean of the space that you have, then it's going to be more difficult for you to compare your result with the other result. Because with one scenario to other scenario, you have to have like divided by one specific number. So in this case, for example, for my case, I divided that with the worst case scenario. I said that the worst case scenario for all the scenarios is that if they don't have a window, it's dark all time. Every note that they are dark. They're just, the room is in the corner, it's closed. There's no window outside. So I compared my scenario to that. Like I divided that. So the ratio is that for me. And I think that's a better ratio. Because if you just get the mean and max only for your study, then it's not comparable. You cannot compare your study with another study, because what if it's generally speaking, your space, because of the layout of your window configuration, what if generally speaking, the average performance is higher, and then therefore your mean to the minimum or max is going to be lower, for example, and then you have this space that the mean DF, generally speaking, it's lower regarding the Illuminance, but when you divided the mean with mean MEAN, the pronunciation is the same as MIN. I just noticed it. So if you are dividing your average DF over the mean, when the space is like that ratio, because the minimum DF is different from one scenario to another scenario, it's harder for you to do the comparison. So I always, the way that I do, even for my dissertation, I always consider it the worst case scenario or to the best case scenario. And then the best case scenario is the case that is the best scenario for all daylight configuration. Or when I do the worst case scenario, is the worst case scenario. It's like I want to have a reference point. That's what I want to say.
All right. Well, thank you. And this has been a very interesting and I think in some ways very provocative discussion. So thank you, Sarah, and thanks to IES for sponsoring today's webinar. I want to, first of all, make a couple of announcements. If you enjoyed today's webinar, please consider joining the IBPSA-USA Research Committee. Email research@ibipsa.us or visit the link that I will post in the chat, and we'll show you how to get involved in webinars like this one. Also, for those of you who are watching us on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We really want to keep you involved and appraised of what we're doing here. I'm going to paste these links now into the chat so you can have access to them. If I can find the chat. I appear to have lost it. Anyway, I want to announce that our next webinar will be on April 29th. We will have Tyler Pillett and Yasser El Masri talking about non-destructive testing. We look forward to seeing you then.